My father-in-law thought I was poor until he saw my mansion. Mike looked at his watch and, once again, felt nervous. He was about to sit down at the table with Claire's family, the woman he loved and dreamed of building a future with. The problem wasn't Claire, nor the love he felt for her. The problem was James, his father-in-law, the patriarch of one of the wealthiest families in town. James was the kind of man who believed success and worth were measured by property, money, and status. He was the kind of man who despised anyone who wasn't at the top of that social hierarchy. Mike knew this, of course, and he also knew that simply being who he was, a regular middle-class man with a good-paying job, but nowhere near the fortune of James, would be enough to put everything at risk. He had to keep up appearances. He couldn't reveal everything about his life. Not now, at least. That evening, Claire had invited him to the family dinner, an opportunity to finally spend more time with her parents. And also, an opportunity for him to try to fit into his father-in-law's world without anyone noticing how out of place he felt. "Remember, Mike," Claire had said earlier, with a nervous smile, "Dad can be a little difficult, but he'll accept you. Just don't lie about who you are, okay? Be yourself." It was good advice, but somewhat naive. Mike knew that in James's presence, being himself would be the biggest mistake he could make. Claire didn't understand she had grown up with everything she ever wanted and never had to worry about what people thought of her. But Mike couldn't risk being seen as poor or unworthy in his father-in-law's eyes. When they arrived at James's house, Mike was greeted by Claire, who was radiant. Her parents, James and his wife Margaret, were already sitting at the table, ready to start dinner. James looked Mike up and down as he entered the room. His gaze was sharp, but disguised with a forced smile. "Welcome, Mike," James said, extending his hand in a rather impersonal way. "I hope you had a good trip." "It was fine, thank you," Mike replied, shaking his hand firmly, but feeling uncomfortable under James's investigative look. He sat next to Claire, trying to remain as natural as possible. The dinner began, and throughout the meal, Mike tried to avoid any conversation that might reveal what he really thought or who he truly was. James, however, didn't seem interested in giving him a break. He started with soft, but pointed comments. "So, Mike," James said, while cutting a slice of meat with precision, "you work at one of those marketing companies, right? Must be fun, but I doubt it's really profitable. I wonder how someone supports a family in that kind of business." Mike felt his heart race. He knew James was trying to provoke him, but he also knew that he couldn't react aggressively. Claire looked at him with an encouraging smile, as if saying, "Don't worry, just ignore it." But Mike knew the confrontation was coming. "True, it's a challenging job," Mike replied calmly, trying not to show that James's words had hit him. "But there's always room to grow, and that's what motivates me." James chuckled lightly, more like a veiled critique than a genuine reaction. "Grow, huh? Well, see how far that takes you. What matters is having the capital for it, right? In this house, we all have a simple philosophy. Without money, you get nowhere. No hard feelings, of course, but that's how things work." Mike wanted to retort, but he knew that wouldn't be a good idea. Claire, as always, tried to change the subject, but James's words still echoed in his mind. He didn't know how much longer he could keep up this facade, this false idea that everything was fine when, in reality, he felt like he was being judged every moment. The dinner ended with a few more subtle comments, but deep down, Mike felt that he would never be fully accepted by James. He didn't have what James considered true success, and perhaps he never would. When the evening ended, Claire tried to cheer him up, but Mike was distant. He knew the worst was yet to come. James wasn't just a businessman, he was a man who viewed life through the lens of money. And Mike didn't have enough money to compete with that. That night, as he lay in bed, Mike stared at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to deal with what seemed like a lost battle. He couldn't hide his true life forever. But what would he do when, inevitably, James found out who he really was? In the days following the dinner, Mike tried to stay optimistic. Claire was being kind and understanding, but he knew their relationship was still far from ideal. In his father-in-law's eyes, James hadn't fully accepted him, maybe not at all, and it consumed him. He knew somehow he had to prove his worth, not for Claire, because she loved him, but for James, who seemed to believe that the only way someone could be worthy of being with his daughter was to be successful, just like he was. James didn't hide his opinions. At work, Mike had already gotten used to the skeptical looks from his colleagues, who thought he had no potential. Now, he was facing something much harder. The judgment of a powerful man, who had lived surrounded by wealth and privilege, and all Mike had were his calloused hands and a solid job, but nothing glamorous or excessive. Claire, however, seemed oblivious to all of this. To her, Mike was the ideal man, someone she wanted to build a life with. But as much as she tried not to let it affect their relationship, Mike felt the weight of the expectation. He didn't know how much longer his patience and calm could withstand the pressure of being constantly compared to James's world. It was then, in the middle of the week, that Mike received an unexpected phone call. It was James. "Mike, I'm coming over tomorrow," he said, with a tone that left no doubt about his intentions. "I want to see where you live." Mike froze when he heard those words. It was clear that James wanted to see if he truly deserved to be with Claire, and the visit could not be good. Mike's house, though comfortable and welcoming, was nothing compared to James's mansion, and, in that moment, he knew that any detail of his home would be meticulously analyzed and most likely judged. "Sure, James," Mike replied, trying to hide his nervousness. "I'd be happy to have you over." When the call ended, Mike sat in the living room and looked around, feeling anxious. He already knew he could no longer hide his life. There was no way to keep up appearances. The modest house, the simple car, and the unpretentious furniture wouldn't be enough to convince James that he was worthy of being with his daughter. When Claire found out about her father's visit, she was concerned. "Don't you think he'll think everything is too simple? He's very demanding, Mike," she said, with a tone that showed a mix of worry and resignation. "I know, Claire, but maybe it's time for him to see that it's not just money that defines people," replied with a tired sigh. "I have to be honest with him, no matter how hard it is." Deep down, Mike knew he was at a crossroads. Either he would leave James with the impression that his life was simple and without great accomplishments, or he would show who he really was and what he had achieved. He didn't want his life to be measured by such a superficial judgment. But at the same time, he feared that might mean the end of everything. The next day, the tension hung in the air. James arrived punctually at Mike's house, with that penetrating look. As always, he observed every detail of the entrance, the furniture, the garden, and the way Mike greeted him. It didn't take long for the first criticism to emerge. "Well, Mike," James said, with an almost sarcastic smile, "looks like you have good taste." "Simple. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's interesting." Mike took a deep breath, holding in the tension. He knew James was just waiting for an opportunity to make a comment that would make him feel inferior. But he also knew he couldn't fall for the provocations. Instead, he tried to stay calm and be as natural as possible. "I like to keep things simple, James," Mike replied. "Life doesn't always need to be complicated to be good." The visit continued with James making increasingly awkward comments about the details of the house. But Mike didn't give in. He was determined not to let James make him doubt himself. When it was finally time to take James to the garden, Mike felt a tightness in his chest. He knew that James's mansion was far from his reality, but somehow, he was ready to face the truth. "If you want, I can show you what I've really achieved," Mike said with a light smile, trying to break the tension. "I think it's time for you to see who I really am." James looked at him with a mix of surprise and curiosity. He expected Mike to hide his true situation once again. But Mike was no longer willing to do that. He wanted James to understand that being successful didn't just mean having money, it was about the choices you made, the risks you took, and most importantly, the respect for others. "If you're willing, James, I think we can make this conversation a little more interesting." James, with a skeptical look, simply nodded. "Let's go then," he replied, his tone still showing distrust, but remaining cautious, as if waiting for a big surprise. Mike led James to the car, trying to control his anxiety. Nervousness pulsed through his veins, but he knew this was the moment to show who he truly was. He felt that the only way to disarm his father-in-law was to let James see for himself what he had achieved, without fear of judgment. They drove towards Mike's house. James seemed skeptical, almost uninterested, looking out the window as the car passed through the quiet suburbs of the city. Mike knew James was probably thinking, "Is this all you've got, Mike?" But he no longer had doubts about what to do. He knew the surprise was coming. The trip didn't take long. When they finally arrived, James fell silent at the sight of the grand entrance of the mansion. The elegant facade, with imposing columns and a meticulously kept garden, was everything he hadn't expected. The house was not only large, but a true masterpiece of design, blending classical and modern elements in a masterful way. The impression it gave was of something that transcended mere luxury, something that spoke directly to the vision and refined taste of its owner. Is this your house?" James asked, unable to hide the shock in his voice. He tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes betrayed his surprise and some discomfort. Mike smiled slightly, trying to hide his nervousness. "Yes, it's my house. Claire and I live here. Let's take a tour. I want to show you what I've built." As they walked toward the entrance, Mike noticed James taking in everything around him, from the fountains in the garden to the wrought iron gates that added a touch of sophistication to the place. What seemed like a simple stroll through the house quickly became a deep analysis. He knew James was looking for any sign that this wasn't real, that he was only pretending to be something he wasn't. "Mike, you really managed all this?" James murmured, visibly surprised. I didn't know you had these kinds of resources. I'm not someone who likes to boast about what I have." "James, I prefer to be more discreet, you know. I built all of this with hard work, smart decisions, and patience," Mike replied, trying not to show too much emotion. He didn't want to seem arrogant, but he didn't want to hide the truth either. James seemed to process the information, but was still uncomfortable. He walked through the house with hesitant steps, lightly touching some of the furniture, as if trying to find something that contradicted the luxury surrounding him, but there was nothing. Each room was more impressive than the last. A dining room with a crystal chandelier, a library with shelves reaching the ceiling, and a living room that seemed to have been taken from an architecture magazine. The walls were adorned with artworks that, to those who knew, were signed by renowned artists. It was clear that Mike not only had wealth, but impeccable taste. Never imagined you live like this," James finally said. After a few minutes of silence, trying to disguise his sense of surprise, Mike felt the weight of those words. He knew that, at that moment, James was allowing himself to see something he had never given the chance to see before, that quick judgments weren't just wrong, they were dangerous. "I understand. James, I know the image you have of me doesn't align with what you see here, but that doesn't change the fact that everything I've done, I did on my own merits," Mike replied, now with more firmness in his voice. "I grew up in a simple family, but I never let that limit me. I knew I could achieve more if I worked hard enough." James, still silent, now walked through the vast living room, his eyes fixed on the walls decorated with photos and awards Mike had earned over the years. He stopped in front of a photo of Mike receiving a Business Excellence Award. James' expression was hard to read, but the silence spoke volumes. He was seeing a man who, in his limited view, he never imagined could build something so grand. I didn't know you'd done so much, Mike," James finally admitted, his tone softer. "I thought you were just another, but you're not." Mike approached James, wanting to take the opportunity to say something he had always kept to himself. "I know you think success is just about having a mansion or a luxury car, but I've learned that it doesn't just come from that. Success is about choices and balance, James. You must know that, as a businessman, but it's easy to forget when wealth becomes so great that it turns into a final goal instead of just a consequence." James looked at Mike, clearly in shock, but now in a more reflective silence. He knew his own beliefs about success and wealth were being challenged at that moment. "I'm not sure I completely understand, Mike, but you've made me think," James said, his voice quieter, without the hostility it used to carry. Maybe I was too quick to judge." And maybe, I've lost sight of what really matters. Mike felt a slight sense of relief, but didn't want to let his guard down just yet. It was clear that James was starting to reassess his opinions, but the real change would come only after a deeper conversation. He knew that wouldn't happen immediately. But James' view was beginning to transform. "I'm not asking you to change your opinion, James. I'm just asking you to see who I really am," Mike said, his voice lighter, tinged with hope. "Now, we can start looking at what really matters." The visit continued in a calmer tone, with James beginning to open up a bit more about his own life, his mistakes, and what he really believed success to be. The wall of judgments was still there, but Mike felt it beginning to dissolve, little by little. Mike's mansion tour continued, but the tension in the air was far from completely dissipating. James, although visibly calmer, still carried a subtle resistance in his gaze. He was trying to process what he had just learned about Mike, the man he saw as a simple guy, who now revealed himself to be an example of perseverance and success. After walking through the house, Mike suggested they sit in the large office, where he had an imposing desk covered in papers and reports from companies he had invested in over the years. The office window showed a stunning view of the garden, and the quiet atmosphere seemed to invite reflection. "Mike, I won't lie to you, this house is impressive, but there's something I can't understand," James began, his tone more measured. "I've always seen you as someone who didn't really know what he wanted, who was just taking advantage of my daughter's kindness. But now, seeing all this, I wonder, why hide all of this from me?" Mike sighed, his gaze fixed on the view outside. He knew this moment would come, and he was ready to finally speak openly about everything. James' words, though harsh, were also an invitation to clarify what he had built and why he preferred to keep his life discreet. "James, I never hid who I am. I just didn't feel the need to share everything with you right away. You know, whenever someone has a piece of success, others tend to look at it with distrust. And I wanted you to get to know me first, to accept me for who I am, not for what I own," Mike replied. Sincerely, James looked at him intently, arms crossed over his chest, as if weighing Mike's words, trying to understand the depth of it all. "I don't understand you, Mike. It seems like you have everything, and yet, you stay here, silent, almost as if you don't want people to know who you really are. Why not show what you've accomplished?" I thought you were like those men who settle for less. Now, you surprise me." Mike felt the tension rising again, but he knew this was the moment to release everything he had been holding inside. It was time for James to see more than just the facade of his life. It was time to understand that Mike's success wasn't just about what he owned, but about the choices he had made, the battles he fought, and the mindset that had propelled him to this point. "I grew up in a family where money wasn't something easily obtained. My mother worked hard her whole life, and my father was always busy dealing with his own failures. I saw firsthand what it means to sacrifice for survival, but I also learned there's so much more to life than just accumulating wealth," Mike began, his tone more serious. "I worked for years in jobs no one wanted. I studied while others were having fun. I made sacrifices you probably can't even imagine. But what I learned most during all that time is that true success is knowing how to balance what you have with who you are. It's not just about money or houses. It's about being at peace with the person you've become along the way." James didn't say anything immediately. He looked at Mike, as if he were absorbing every word, perhaps for the first time truly understanding that by judging so quickly, he had ignored the true essence of what it meant to be successful. "I see now, Mike," James murmured, almost imperceptibly. "I see that you are not the man I imagined. But this makes me reflect because the way I saw you was based only on what I thought was right. And the truth is, in all of this, my vision was limited." Mike watched him closely. "You judged me based on what others see, James, on appearances, on what people think success means. But I want you to understand that success is a personal journey. It can be being happy with what you have, with what you've built, or even with what you've chosen to leave behind. I don't shame my story, and I don't shame my hard work. James seemed to finally start to understand. The look of distrust that once dominated his face began to give way to something closer to respect. He leaned forward, looking Mike directly in the eye. I really didn't know who you were, Mike," James said, with a slight smile. "I thought success was just about having money, being the richest, the most powerful. But you've shown me that there is something more, something beyond what others see. Something built with honesty, with tough choices. I was wrong." Mike felt a faint sense of victory. He knew that James was far from fully transformed, but it was clear that he was beginning to question his own values. The confrontation hadn't been easy, but it was undoubtedly one of the most revealing moments in James's life. "I don't expect you to change your mind overnight, James," Mike replied, with a calm smile, "but I hope that, at least, you begin to see things differently. Success, for me, is being true, being faithful to my choices, and, above all, being worthy of what I've built." James looked at Mike, and now there was a gleam in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I never saw it that way, but I'll try to look at things more carefully. Maybe I was too quick to judge." They sat in silence for a moment, both reflecting on the words exchanged. The confrontation, which had seemed impossible, had finally opened a door to new understanding, a possibility for change. Mike felt he was gaining something far more important than James's acceptance. He was gradually gaining respect for who he really was. The silence in the mansion was heavy, but not with tension. After the frank conversation, there was something lighter in the air, as if a curtain had been pulled back. And Mike's true vision, his life, and his values had finally been revealed. James, though still introspective, no longer looked at Mike with the heavy judgment he had before. He was deeply reflecting on everything he had heard, and a sense of respect, albeit discreet, was beginning to take hold. Mike, for his part, wasn't in a hurry. He knew that this shift in perspective wouldn't happen overnight, but this was an important step. He didn't want to force anything, just allow James to digest everything he had learned and realize that afternoon. I really had no idea how hard you worked, Mike," James said after a long silence, his voice softer. "In my head, I saw you as someone who only wanted the easy way, not understanding that, in fact, you built your life from scratch, in the hardest possible way." Mike looked at his father-in-law with a sincere smile. "I didn't ask to be seen like that, James. I just wanted you to understand that I'm more than my bank account or the house I live in. All of this came with work and sacrifice. It wasn't luck." James nodded, seeming to finally accept the truth that was before him. The critical look had given way to an expression of reflection. "I was wrong about you, Mike, and I was also wrong about what it means to be successful. I see you differently now." Mike knew. He didn't need more words to know that something important had changed. James, the man who had always been relentless, was now acknowledging the importance of looking at people in a more fair, more human way. And that, for Mike, meant more than anything else. As they stood up to leave the office, James looked at Mike with a more genuine smile. "I really admire what you've done. Not just anyone can build something so solid and, at the same time, maintain their integrity. You've taught me something important today, eh?" Mike didn't want to respond immediately. It wasn't necessary. He knew that by the end of this conversation, James had undergone a significant change. He had let go of his pride and prejudice, and that, for Mike, was already a great victory. Later, during dinner, Claire noticed the difference in the atmosphere. The mood was lighter. James, who had always been so direct and critical, now seemed more relaxed. He was laughing at Claire's jokes and even making complimentary comments about the dishes she had prepared. Mike and Claire exchanged looks. For her, that moment was important because it meant that, finally, her father was beginning to see Mike as the man she had always known he was. Not for his possessions or his wealth, but for his true nature. After dinner, while everyone was gathered in the living room, James approached Mike and extended his hand to him. "I was wrong about you, Mike, and for that, I apologize. You deserve to be with Claire, and I hope we can move forward with respect and maybe even friendship." Mike, surprised by the sincerity in James's words, shook his hand firmly. "I never asked for anything, James. I just wanted you to understand me, and now that that's happened, I hope we can be a family for real." Claire smiled as she saw the scene. The weight of words, judgment, and hostility seemed to have dissipated. For the first time, she felt that her father and her boyfriend were on the same path, and that filled her with a quiet joy. The night continued with casual conversation, laughter, and an atmosphere of harmony that, for a moment, seemed unimaginable. James, still reflective, knew he was changing, but now, he didn't see it as a loss of his identity, but as an evolution. When the guests said their goodbyes, Mike and Claire stayed in the living room, enjoying the comforting silence. Mike, with a discreet smile, looked at Claire. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "Yes," she replied with a warm smile, "and more than ever. Now, it feels like we all finally understand what's truly important." And as the clock marked the end of that night, with the soft sound of the wind outside, and the sense of a new beginning in the air, Mike realized that the respect he had gained wasn't just about wealth, but about being true to oneself. He had, finally, shown James that the true measure of success is not found in appearances, but in choices, actions, and above all, in the heart.